On the way home from work, a couple of weeks later, my father stopped off at the Newsreel Theater to catch the filmed coverage of the von Ribbentrop dinner. It was then that he learned from Shepsy Turchwell, whom he visited up in the booth after the show, that on the 1st of June his old boyhood friend was leaving for Winnipeg with his wife and his 3 children, his mother and his wife's elderly parents. Representatives of Winnipeg's small Jewish community had helped Mr. Turchwell to find work as a projectionist at a neighborhood movie house there, and had located apartments for the entire family in a modest Jewish neighborhood much like our own. The Canadians had also arranged a low-interest loan to pay for the Turchwells' move from America and to assist with the support of the in-laws until Mrs. Turchwell found a job in Winnipeg that would enable her to cover her parents' living expenses. Mr. Turchwell told my father that he hated parting from his native city and his dear old friends, and that of course he regretted leaving his one-of-a-kind job at Newark's most important theater. There was much to leave and much to lose, but he was convinced by all the raw and edited film he'd been watching for the past several years, from newsreel crews working around the world, that the secret side of the pact reached in Iceland between Lindbergh and Hitler in 1941 provided for Hitler first to defeat the Soviet Union, then to invade and conquer England, and only after that, and after the Japanese had overrun China, India, and Australia, thus completing the creation of their new order in Greater East Asia, for America's president to establish the American Fascist New Order, a totalitarian dictatorship modeled on Hitler's that would set the stage for the last great continental struggle, the German invasion, conquest, and Nazification of South America. 2 years down the line, with Hitler's swastika flying from London's Houses of Parliament, the rising sun flying over Sydney, New Delhi, and Peking, and Lindbergh having been elected to the presidency for another 4 years, the U.S. border with Canada would be closed, diplomatic relations between the two countries would be severed, and so as to focus on the Americans, on their grave international danger that necessitated the curtailment of their constitutional rights, the onslaught would begin en masse against America's 4.5 million Jews. In the wake of von Ribbentrop's Washington visit and the triumph it represented for the most dangerous of Lindbergh's American supporters, this was Mr. Turchwell's forecast, and it was so much more pessimistic than anything my father was predicting that he decided not to repeat it to us, or, when he got home from the Newsreel Theater for dinner early that evening, to say anything about the Turchwells' imminent departure, certain the news would terrify me, rile Sandy, and set my mother clamoring to emigrate at once. Since Lindbergh's inauguration, a year and a half earlier, there were established to be only 200 or 300 Jewish families who had taken up permanent residence in the haven of Canada. The Turchwells were the first such fugitives that my father knew personally, and learning of their decision had left him shaken. And then there was the shock of seeing on film the Nazi von Ribbentrop and his wife warmly greeted on the White House portico by the President and Mrs. Lindbergh, and the shock of seeing all the prominent guests stepping from their limousines and smiling with anticipation at the prospect of dining and dancing in von Ribbentrop's presence, and among the guests, seemingly no less thrilled than the others by the disgusting occasion, Rabbi Lionel Bengelsdorf and Miss Evelyn Finkel. I could not believe it, my father said. The smile on her face is a mile wide, and the husband-to-be, he looks like he thinks the dinner is for him. You should see this man, nodding at everyone as if he actually mattered. But why did you go? My mother asked him. When it was bound to upset you like this. I went, he told her, because every day I ask myself the same question. How can this be happening in America? How can people like these be in charge of our country? If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I'd think I was having a hallucination. Though we had only just begun dinner, Sandy set down his silverware, mumbled, "But nothing is happening in America, nothing," and left the table, and not for the first time, since the morning my mother had smacked him across the face. At meals now, should the smallest reference be made to the news, Sandy would get up without explanation or apology, disappear into our room, pulling the door shut behind him. The first few times my mother got up after him and went in to talk with him and invite him back to the table, but Sandy would sit at his desk, sharpening a charcoal pencil or doodling with it on his drawing pad until she let him be. My brother wouldn't even speak to me when, merely out of loneliness, I dared to ask how much longer he was going to act like this. I began to wonder if he might not pick up and leave home, and not for Aunt Evelyn's, but to live with the Mahaneys on their Kentucky farm. He'd change his name to Sandy Mahoney, and we'd never see him again. Just as we were never going to see Alvin, and nobody need bother to kidnap him. He'd do it himself, hand himself over to the Christians, so as never again to have anything to do with Jews. Nobody needed to kidnap him because Lindbergh had kidnapped him already, along with everyone else. Sandy's behavior so unsettled me that, in the evenings, I took to doing my homework out of sight of him at the kitchen table. That was how I came to overhear my father, who was in the living room with my mother, reading the evening paper, there while Sandy remained in contemptuous seclusion at the back of the flat, reminding her that our private turmoil was exactly the sort of dissension that Lindbergh, anti-Semites, had hoped to stir up between Jewish parents and their children with programs like Just Folks. Understanding this, however, had only hardened his resolve not to follow Shepsy Churchwell's lead and leave. "What are you talking about?" said my mother. "Are you telling me that the Churchwells are going to Canada?" "In June, yes," he replied. "Why? Why June? What is happening in June? When did you find out? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I knew it would upset you." "And it has! Why shouldn't it? Why?" she demanded to know. "Why, Herman? Why are they leaving in June?" "Because, in Shepsy's judgment, the time has come. Let's not discuss it," my father said softly. "The little one is in the kitchen, and he's frightened enough. If Shepsy feels it's time, that is his decision for himself and his family, and good luck to him. Shepsy sits and watches the latest news hour after hour. The news is Shepsy's life, and the news is terrible, and so it affects how he thinks, and this is the decision he came up with." "The man came up with the decision," my mother said, "because he is informed." "I am also informed," he said sharply. "I am no less informed. I have just reached a different conclusion. Don't you understand that these anti-Semitic bastards want us to run away? They want to get the Jews so fed up with everything," he told her, "that they leave for good. And then the Goyim will have this wonderful country all to themselves. Well, I have a better idea. Why don't they leave, the whole bunch of them? Why don't they all go live under the Fuhrer in Nazi Germany? Then we will have a wonderful country. Look, Shepsy can do whatever he thinks is right, but we aren't going anywhere. There is still a Supreme Court in this country, thanks to Franklin Roosevelt. It is a liberal Supreme Court, and it is there to look after our rights. There is Justice Douglas, there is Justice Frankfurter, there is Justice Murphy and Justice Black. They are there to uphold the law. There are still good men in this country. There is Roosevelt, there is Ix, there is Mayor LaGuardia. In November, there is a congressional election. There is still the ballot box, and people can still vote without anybody telling them what to do." "And what will they vote for?" my mother asked, and immediately answered herself. "The American people will vote," she said, "and the Republicans will be even stronger." "Quiet. Try to keep your voice down, will you? When November comes," he told her, "we'll find out the results, and there'll be time then to decide what to do." "And if there isn't time?" "There will be. Please, Bess," he said. "This cannot go on every night." And his was the last word, though it was probably only because of me doing my homework in the kitchen that my mother forced herself to say no more. The next day, right after school, I walked down Chancellor Avenue and around to Clinton Place, and then beyond the high school to where I figured chances were slight that anybody would recognize me, and waited for a bus downtown to the Newsreel Theater. I'd checked the newspaper timetable the night before. There was an hour-long show beginning at 5 minutes to 4, which meant that I could catch a 5 o'clock 14 at the Broad Street stop, across from the theater, and be safely back in time for dinner, or even earlier, depending on when von Ribbentrop was slotted into the program. One way or another, I had to see Aunt Evelyn at the White House, and not because, like my parents, I was appalled and outraged by what she was doing, but because her having gone there at all seemed to me more remarkable than anything that could possibly befall a member of our family, except for what had befallen Alvin. "Nazi bigwig White House guest," was the black-lettered headline spilled out across either side of the theater's triangular marquee, and along with my being downtown without my brother, or Earl Axman, or one of my parents, it made me feel powerfully delinquent when I stepped up to the box office window and asked for a ticket. Unaccompanied by an adult? No, sir, the woman selling tickets told me. I'm an orphan, I told her. I live at the orphanage on Lyons Avenue. The sister sent me to do a report on President Lindbergh. Where's her note? I'd carefully written one out on the bus, using a blank page from my notebook, and handed it through the money slot. It was modeled after the notes of permission my mother wrote for school trips, only it was signed Sister Mary Catherine, St. Peter's Orphanage. The woman looked at it without reading it, then beckoned for me to push my money over. I gave her one of Alvin's tens, a huge bill for a kid of my size, let alone an orphan from St. Peter's. But she was busy and gave me back $9.50 in change and slipped me a ticket without any fuss. She failed, however, to return the note. I need that, I said. Let's go, Sonny, she said impatiently, and motioned for me to make room for the people still lining up for the next show. I got inside just as the lights went out, and the martial music came on and the film began to roll. Because, seemingly, every man in Newark, the theater drew only a very few women, wanted to get a look at the unlikely White House guest, the place was filled to capacity for this late Friday afternoon show, and the only empty seat I could find was in the far reaches of the balcony. Anyone entering now would have to stand at the back of the orchestra's last row. A great excitement came over me, not only because of my having pulled off something that was not expected of me, but because, enveloped by the fumes of the hundreds of cigarettes and the extravagant odor of the 5-cent cigars, I felt deep in the virile magic of a boy masquerading as a man among men. British land on Madagascar to take over French naval base. Pierre Laval, chief of Vichy French government, denounces British move as an act of aggression. RAF bombs Stuttgart, third consecutive night. British fighter planes in savage air battle over Malta. German army resumes assault on USSR in the Kerch Peninsula. Mandalay falls to Japanese army in Burma. Japanese army launches new drive in jungles of New Guinea. Japanese army marches into Yunnan province of China from Burma. Chinese guerrillas raid city of Canton, killing 500 Japanese troops. A multitude of helmets, uniforms, weapons, buildings, harbors, beaches, flora, fauna, faces of every race, but otherwise the same inferno again and again. The unsurpassable evil from whose horrors the United States, of all the great nations, was alone in being spared. Picture after picture of misery without end. The mortars bursting, the infantrymen doubled over and running machines, with raised rifles waiting ashore, airplanes dropping bombs, airplanes blown apart and spiraling to earth, the mass graves, the kneeling chaplains, the improvised crosses, the sinking ships, the drowning sailors, the sea in flames, the shattered bridges, the tank bombardment, the targeted hospitals sheared in two, pillars of fire coiling upward from bombed-out oil tanks, prisoners corralled in a sea of mud, stretchers bearing living torsos, bayoneted civilians, dead babies, beheaded bodies, bubbling blood, and then the White House. A twilight spring evening, shadows falling across the sprawl of the lawn. Blooming bushes, flowering trees, limousines driven by liveried chauffeurs, and everyone exiting them in formal attire. From the marble hallway beyond the open portico doors, a string ensemble playing last year's #1 hit song, Intermezzo, popularized from a theme in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Gracious smiles, quiet laughter, the lean, beloved, handsome president. Beside him, the talented poetess, daring aviatrix, and decorous socialite who is the mother of their murdered child. The loquacious, silver-haired, honored guest, the elegant Nazi spouse in her long satin gown, welcoming words, witticism of the old-world gallant, steeped in the theatrics of the royal court, and looking in his evening clothes like $1,000,000, charmingly kissed the First Lady's hand. Had it not been for the Iron Cross awarded to the foreign minister by his Fuhrer, and embellishing the pocket just inches below the impeccably arranged silk handkerchief, as persuasively civilized a sham as human cunning could devise. And we will pause there.